Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics Beyond the Book, a show that breaks down the fundamental concepts behind tabletop games and how we play them. I am your host, Max, as always, and joining me, also as always, is Troy. And of course, working behind the scenes is our fantastic producer, Jay, who apparently does such a good job you all think it's AI. Today's episode is about magic and powers. Mostly about magic, but I think we can lean into things like psionics and superpowers and that domain of stuff.
The extra, the supernatural, the beyond, all that is in count. The force, like all that counts.
Yep, the force is totally that type of thing. Any of the 40K psyker stuff.
Oh, the warp, yeah, the Imperium. Mm-hmm. That is magic.
Magic by any other name.
Straight up,
right?
100% sci-fantasy for you, baby. I traditionally have shied away from magical characters, large in part because of the density of Vancian magic systems.
Okay.
With like bespoke, here's a statement spell named after the wizard who invented it, and it works thusly, and you must have it prepared in such a way. And that never felt like the magic that I read about in fiction, right? That felt like a totally different thing to me, and I never felt the magic fantasy was being fulfilled with that. How do you feel about playing a wizard, or is that a thing you commonly do? Do you avoid it?
That's a good question. So just for everyone's context, Vancian magic, named after the author Jack Vance, mostly based on his Dying Earth stories, which are a kind of science fantasy, post-apocalyptic. Actually, technically Dying Earth is its own genre that is different from post-apocalyptic, but nevertheless, they share a lot in common, so I'll stick with that. And the characteristic thing about Vancian magic in the Dying Earth setting, you have spells, you memorize the spells, and then when you cast the spells, the knowledge and memory of the spell leaves as the magic leaves when you cast it. And so this is reflected primarily in Dungeons and Dragons. I think that's sort of the earliest precursor of a game system based on that idea.
Yes, I agree with that for sure.
That's basically how wizards work. You choose your spells for the day, and then when you cast them, you draw a line through it, and it's done. If you want to cast the same spell, depending on how your GM does it, but very often you just memorize the same thing over and over again. So you put down the same thing 3 or 4 times.
You put down magical bullets. They might be the same bullet, but you load your magic brain gun with your ammunition for the day.
You can write magic missile for every spell you can memorize if you want. But you can also, more strategically, you probably want to write down a few things. To some degree, I like the Vancian system. I have played wizards in D&D. I played a wizard in a 2nd edition game.
Oh, so right in the heart of shit.
So what I like about it is that it is unique and it has a particular feel about it. And that feel feels very quirky and old school. I don't know how to describe it. Is it my preferred magic system? No, but I think it's fine. I think people have a lot of issue with it. It's like you were describing. That's not how I imagine magic to work, unless of course you've read Dying Earth.
Yes, right.
I mean, what can I say about it? It's one way of doing things. And some people, even way back in the day, they immediately threw that out. I mean, Tunnels and Trolls does not use a Vancian system.
Yeah, that's actually true.
Uses a point system, which is actually, I would argue, by and large, one of the more common ways of doing magic in, I think, certainly role-playing games, possibly war games.
Computer games and stuff a lot.
Computer games, especially.
Yeah, a lot of war games kind of use magic points, but they'll like tie them to like what level of sorcerer you are. If you're like a level 3 sorcerer, you can cast 3 times. And it's like, that's kind of a magic point system, but it's just
right.
described as a tier system instead. But basically the same idea.
When it's bigger points, usually, like you're not carrying around like 15, you're probably carrying around like 5.
Yeah, totally.
And, Vancian system still holds up today. games that a lot of OSR games, obviously OSE, because it is literally just BX D&D, but also Lamentations of the Flame Princess. I think White Hat and Black Hat both use that. It's certainly what a lot of people consider to be the default. How do I feel about playing Magic characters? That's a good question.
Yeah, a Magic character in a campaign can be the focal point for many reasons. And sometimes it's fun to do that. In other cases, they may be a completely awesome clutch enabling support character too. Like there's a lot a Magic user can be. But what have you found fits your playstyle as a Magic guy in a campaign you've played in?
I think a lot of the time, if I do play a Magic user, I like to play them as something like a problem solver with a lot of extra tools.
Yes, like not just an elemental destructive force per se, but more of like a Swiss Army knife.
I have played battle mages. I don't usually. I tend to like to play someone who is more of an explorer than necessarily a combat focus. That doesn't mean I'm not packing heat.
Right.
Like,
yeah, for sure.
If I have access to Fireball, I'm probably going to keep at least one of those around. But I also like having a mixture of illusions. I've played straight up illusionists, and I've actually had the most fun as a Magic user as an illusionist in varying systems.
I have a divination wizard in my campaign right now that I'm GMing or DMing. Ooh. And it's great. Like how they're not just, they're not a siege weapon, that you can bring with you into a hallway. Mm-hmm. They're like, they're anticipatory in these exciting ways, and they can manipulate the dice, and there's cool things they're doing that make them more than just the most powerful guy in the room. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. I've had people play necromancers to a interesting degree, and I think that's the thing about a lot of not every interpretation of necromancers in D&D, but certainly older ones. They're not at early levels. They're not exactly what you think they are. They have more. They have like spells like Feeble Mind and Death Knell.
Oh.
That more like goofing with people's like hit points and stats, and then they sort of start raising the dead. But a lot of it is like, I would call it life force manipulation.
Oh, that's actually really interesting, because it puts them in this, for lack of a better term, this like debuff category where they sort of have to learn to live on the margins of a fight before they can really start to dominate it with their summons and their constructs.
It's more like curses.
Yeah.
A lot of the time.
Totally.
And then you get to kind of put cannon fodder on the field.
Mm-hmm.
And like zombies and skeletons, I mean, they're somewhat effective, but I can't say that most games, they don't last that long.
No.
And again, my experience is going from playing, most of my games have been playing third and 3.5 or playing second and 2.5.
I've got a little bit of second in me. I've got a fair bit of 3.5. And then recently I've been DMing 5 or 5.5 or whatever nomenclature it is. But like my wizard in my party is doing fantastic things. I really enjoy the way they changed the game with the access to abilities that give them non-combat outcomes. And not that combat's bad. Like I love a sword fight. I'm a wargamer. But like the way that they can have a social ending to a fight, I really enjoy by using sleep or by using these powers at different opportunities to save them from having just to like, well, I short sworded that guy in the face and now he's dead,
Right.
and it then lets us role play the next scene as they've got a hostage, but they're having a hard time because they're kind of new to playing non-terrible alignment characters for the most part.
Oh, okay.
So it's like, I'm not just letting them like, we got everything we need out of him, slit his throat. It's like, you can't do that. You're good alignment. Like you literally like, do you want a will save to see if you lose alignment here and like lose some of your powers, or are you going to not be a terrible monster? So they're kind of like having to get their head around being a different alignment than they're perhaps used to. But aside from that, the way they use their powers, especially the wizard, has been really cool to watch. So I like what Vancian Magic can do, but for me, the Magic I like most, and you might like this from your games that have done this, but I like ones where you sort of author a spell and then it assembles some type of challenge level, cost, or DC that you have to beat.
Right. Okay. So we're talking about, I guess, what I guess I call spell bending.
Yes.
To kind of borrow from Avatar, Last Airbender.
Yeah.
But it's sort of the idea that you use the thing to take shape, and what you're manipulating is either the narrative structure of that thing. So there's no rote magic, or, I mean, there can be, obviously. As I mentioned in the last episode, but I guess I can iterate more. We were talking about mage.
Yeah.
And I said there are no fixed spells. That's not true. There are rote spells, and they do give you a bonus for being rote, but that's not what I would call the philosophical default of the game. Because, like, if you find something that works, obviously you're going to use it more than once.
Yeah, that's really true.
Okay, so games that work in that dimension, obviously Mage, and by virtue of that, Ars Magica, which I can explain a little bit more here. So Ars Magica uses a system based on a hermetic word sort of phrase or word construction. So when you want to cast a spell in Ars Magica, you use a verb-noun combination, and it's usually using this sort of like Latin, Greek-ish language. So like an example would be, I would use the term creto ignum, right? Create fire.
Okay.
There's a lot of ways. Another system that does not so much in the, I don't exactly know, maybe you can help me kind of figure out exactly where the emphasis between these systems are, but the Genesis system, it's magic.
I love that.
It's a really cool idea. I don't even think they do it enough justice. Fantasy Flight, come on, wake up.
Yeah, agreed about that point too. But like Terranoth is a fine setting, it's okay. But my problem is like there's not enough interesting things to do in it in terms of like outside of what you would do in a level 1 to 10 starting World of Warcraft environment. Like it's literally what it feels like.
Yeah.
And then the magic system though, where you assemble keywords that have associated costs with them and it builds the difficulty out. And the further you push the spell, the more challenging it becomes. So that really anyone can attempt anything. It's just a matter of your likelihood of success based on your experience. And you can assemble crazy spells.
What I would say that is one difference about the way that Fantasy Flight's Genesis system does this, more broadly, like to use the underlying system, is rather than it being this, like, as I said, like creto ignum, or I want to stop all of the atoms in this glass from moving. So in Mage, it would be like time and matter, or some variation on that.
Oh, those would be the spheres, yeah.
Those would be the spheres that you'd be tapping into, maybe. I mean, depends on the specific details. The GM might want to dig more into what you actually are trying to get out of it, which is part of the fun of that. And again, Ars Magica, same dealy. In the case of Genesis, I find it's more gamist.
Yeah.
What you're adding to it is you're taking from one list, bolt, blast, wave, or some, like you choose a form for it.
Yeah.
Then you go down a series of elements. You pick fire, ice, void, whatever. You pick one of those. So you now have a shape to the magic, you have an element to the magic, and then what you start doing is you start putting in, well, I want it to be quick, or I want it to shoot at a really long range, or I want it to have like a residual effect. I want it to set people on fire. And so you tack on all of these things, and as you do that, you make it bulkier and then thus kind of harder to execute.
Yeah.
And that happens in the other systems, like Ars and Mage do that as well, but it feels more narratively focused on those games, whereas in Genesis, I feel that it's much more mechanically focused.
Yeah, it's the keywords are like Lego blocks that click, and that's how you're assembling a spell. It's not quite as ephemeral as just making a statement that you and the GM reason out. It's much more like, yo, here are the specific knobs and whistles that you play with, you know? and that will assemble your spell with this associated cost, and you're thinking about it in terms of magical keywords, and not in terms of like a flow state of magic. So I put Genesis in the halfway point between something more Vancian and something more like totally spellbending.
I don't know that I'd put it in the Vancian category, because there's an element of risk behind putting too many variables and biting off more than you can chew. But the fun thing about that system is about pushing the limit of it, right?
Yeah.
I would actually relate it to so we've had Vancian, we've had magic points, we've had spellbending. My personal favorite for a lot of games is what I would call a chaos magic system. And obviously that partly takes from esoteric chaos magic, which is its whole thing, but it also takes from things like the Elric novels.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Their descendants, like Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40,000, but fantasy, I think, leans more specifically into that direction. And this is the idea that this is my preferred magic system, which is you can cast magic, and it obviously requires some knowledge and skill, but what you're putting into it isn't I'm going to run out or it's not going to be strong enough. It's that it'll whip me back in the face. Like I'm playing with fire.
Yes.
I always like that because it makes the magic user feel a touch unstable. And it always adds a special kind of flavor to the character. Because if you're playing like a Vancian mage in a D&D game, you're like, as I said, like in that context, the way I've played them, I like to play them kind of like an explorer, whereas, explorer or a scholar.
As an academic.
Yeah, as an academic character. If I'm playing in like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and I'm playing a magic user, I guess if I'm playing like a proper wizard, I'm playing something like that scholarly person. Obviously, you're narrowed into a particular field.
Yes.
But a lot of messing with magic in that setting and in other settings like that is that you are kind of a mad scientist / atomic bomb.
100% you are.
And this extends to things like Psychers and 40K, where it's like, yeah, you're highly disciplined and extremely valued, but we know you could open a portal, like you could open a hole into the warp and demons would come out, probably out of your face.
Yeah.
And we would all be poorer for that. And so it's this extreme risk reward thing. And so that goes like Dungeon Crawl Classics does magic that way. It does it in a more sort of goofy gonzo way, but still the idea is, like you have these spells, and like the way that DCC does it, it's like one spell takes up like 2 pages. Whereas in like Dungeons and Dragons, it takes up like part of a page.
Right.
And the reason it takes up 2 pages is because you roll to cast, and the success on that roll increases the power of that effect. And you can choose a lesser version of it as long as you're using the vanilla rules. There's some where like you can lose control of it and it like, yeah, you have to use the maximum effect. I love those rules. There's this fun idea that you're messing with stuff that you probably shouldn't be messing with. And that adds so much extra theming to the world and the game that I find something like the magic in D&D. I mean, D&D is more of a heroic game. I know you can play evil characters and you can do all kinds of, you can play it however you want. Don't let anyone, including the company, tell you how to play the game. Okay? It's whatever you're doing at your table. If people like it, that's what you're doing. Now, obviously, you have to work out who's cool with what, but that point still stands. So, yeah, D&D is more of a heroic, I guess it used to be a heroic dungeon crawling game.
Yeah, now it's...
And then it kind of expanded into other things.
It's more of a story beat game now in many respects, but like in a fun way with lots of like bells and whistles. But it's a lot more about hitting plot points than it is about exploring dungeons. Though your plot points can be inside of dungeons.
Sure.
Thereby having like an homage to that. And there's a new book coming that's like 4 dungeons, 4 dragons. There's like a whole thing about it. So it's kind of cool that that's getting a reference again. But you're right. There's a very certain type of fantasy and a certain type of magic that goes along with it that D&D promises you don't get in fantasy role play. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I mean.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about where D&D gets its magic vibe from, like its theming. Because you were to say, oh, well, it's Lord of the Rings. And I'm like, yeah, it's not really. Because wizards in that are more akin to like divine beings that are not of the world.
Yeah, there's not wizards per se. There are people who can do wizardly things and are called wizards, but they're not like a wizard in the convention of it being a mortal man or woman or whatever that's like, got a staff now and I'm the wizard.
Yeah.
It's like, that dude is a Maiar.
Yeah, they didn't, well, I mean, they did learn things, obviously, but they're more of a static character with a lot of power. And yeah, more of an abstracted being. So clearly, like, aside from some of the aesthetic, like, Gandalf and the hat and the robe and the staff, it doesn't really get that. Obviously, it gets some of its premises from Dying Earth.
Yeah, it does.
It doesn't really get its vibe from that because the Dying Earth is a super weird setting. Like, some of it, yeah, there's a bit of that flavor that comes over for sure. But I wouldn't say that it feels like that for the most part. And it's funny, whenever I try to make a mental, and then the other thing that it might be is like, oh, well, there's a lot of Conan in old D&D.
Oh, okay.
But it doesn't resemble that magic system either. Like, Conan magic is like ritual magic.
Mm-hmm.
It requires a lot of stages. It's sometimes more like an elaborate technique or preparation or some kind of elaborate ritual that has more of a broad sweeping effect than throwing a fireball. It could be curses or at least that's suggested. There's certainly a lot of summoning things from the shadows. There's divination spells. Probably take a lot from the Conan world.
Oh, yes, that would make sense. A lot of like the non-combat or pre-combat type of magic. Yeah.
Magic is very obscure in Howard's setting.
You never get a sense of how it actually works.
Yeah, and that's part of how it works in a literary sense. That's why because there's this mystery that's retained about it. You understand that it's a series of procedures and it has these sort of very specific but still very obscure effects. As I said, like summoning a monster to kill your enemy or like summoning up a wind to like make a battlefield more difficult for your opponent. And occasionally it's like, oh, well, I know so-and-so is here and they have so-and-so. There's even like technology in Conan. So like I remember there's one story where there's like a desert city and they've got, what are they? They're like radium lamps that you can turn on by touching them. And it's described more like technology than like magic.
Right.
But to Conan, what's the difference?
Yeah, 100%.
But like, yeah, where does D&D get its, because it's not from any of those things. And then if I think about like, oh, well, what is that? I'm like, I think of like Elminster from like Forgotten Realms. And I'm like, but that's after the fact. That's not the source of it. That's what comes from that. So like I mean, I know there's other fiction that's built around that idea, like a lot of, I don't want to be crass and call them Tolkien imitators, but like.
Let's take a look at something else, though. Maybe we're chasing this the wrong way.
Okay.
Because it might be a mechanical decision to avoid magic points altogether.
The Vancian system 100% is a bookkeeping shortcut.
Right?
I mean, that's the whole reason that armor class works the way that it does. It's like, oh, well, armor doesn't make you harder to hit. It absorbs hits. And it's like, yeah, but it's more expedient to do that in one roll than it is to do two rolls, especially for a convention game. So like Vancian magic is a very designed thing where it's like, oh, well, you just have this list of stuff and you cross it out. And then the beginning of the next day or the end of the day, you pick new spells. And then it has an intuitive selection cycle. So like end of the day, you pick new spells. It's very easy to keep track of them. You just line them out, go again, something you can keep on a scrap piece of paper. They do include things like components and stuff like that. But like, I'm more thinking about like, where does the view of the wizard come from in D&D?
Yeah.
Like it seems to be an amalgamation of stuff, but it almost seems like its own thing.
What's kind of fun about it is that there's not a cap on the count of wizards, right? Like it doesn't limit.
double-edged thing.
True.
But yeah,
no,
go
very
ahead.
true. Like you can have barkeeps in Baldur's Gate that can, time stop, which is like, what would be the societal implications of your bartenders being able to stop time? Like, that what?
I have a lot of thematic issues with Forgotten Realms. I don't know if I've said that yet, but
If you haven't said it, you've implied it.
It's not. If I haven't said it, I've certainly implied it. Forgotten Realms is what I call kitchen sink fantasy. And that doesn't mean there aren't amazing stories and obviously amazing games and amazing experiences people have. There's a lot of adventures that come from Forgotten Realms that I think are just gold.
Yeah.
Like Pool of Radiance.
Right.
Not the video game, but the 3rd edition campaign that they based on that idea. It's well constructed. It's not like amazing, but it's like, wow, that's a fun adventure. And it's got some high stakes and it's good. But the world feels more like a patchwork quilt of ideas that don't really sync up. And so it's, as I said, I use the term kitchen sink fantasy. It wants to have everything in it and make sense at the same time. And it you just can't do that. The more sensible ways are either you go to the Warhammer fantasy direction where magic is something that most people are afraid of and don't mess with, and there's a few people who are allowed to, and the people who are the mavericks are kind of the bad guys. There's some rules there where like the barkeep can't know magic because either the witch hunters are going to get him or he's going to blow himself up.
Right.
Eventually. Or you can go the other way and do the Eberron thing, where magic is so ubiquitous that it's basically an analog for technology.
Right. Like the only reason people have the technological devices they have is because they're fundamentally arcane.
Yeah, and I quite like Eberron. I don't have a problem with a high magic setting, and I don't even have a problem with a middling magic setting. But Forgotten Realms, as much as it's kind of a staple of games, is very much like it's trying to have its cake and eat it too kind of problem that I have. Another good example is you have all these houses and stuff, and they just, like these villages and dales and stuff like that, and they just exist in the world. And then there's like monsters and trolls and dragons and all this stuff. And I understand magic plays some role in keeping them from like destroying everybody, but there's no way that human culture or technology would adapt to those things being the way that they are as like a medieval fantasy like world. Like,
yes,
at least in Warhammer Fantasy, they describe a lot of buildings in the Empire. If they are not in a city, the entire lower floor is described as being like reinforced stone. And there honestly aren't that many other, I'm talking about like coaching inns.
Yeah.
Right. But also like any other fortification is like, yeah, because beastmen could come out of the woods and ruin your life. The fact that people live outside of the city is rare anyway. So that makes the areas between cities really interesting.
A note on the Forgotten Realms or Faerun that I like about it, but is a challenge about it, is like in my current campaign, I have a drow and a couple halflings, and we've had a human and a gnome come in and out. But one of the halfling players was like, "Oh, I would be freaked out by a drow joining us," and I'm like, "Yeah, maybe you would, but you can't apply that type of logic to this game." Because they're in your party. They're your friend. Like, that's the logic of this game more than it is like, well, technically aren't drow like dangerous in many regards, to certain groups or cultures or whatever. So shouldn't I like be wary of them? And it's like, well, yeah, maybe, but like that type of internal consistency or logic does not apply here. And that is a flexibility that allows you to just have anyone meet up or to have any band of adventurers be the solution to really any problem, is because nothing really holds up to that much scrutiny.
Sure.
I like it because I can improvise as a dungeon master really readily. And that is my favorite part about it, is I don't need to over prepare for a session, and I can use tools like Wikipedias and stuff like that to fill in blanks in my knowledge, instead of having to be like, I don't know, who is that? Who is the mayor here? I can be like, no, there is a mayor here. It's this guy. And I'll fill in the blank of who they are. Maybe I'll get a sentence about them if I'm lucky. And I'll fill out the rest, obviously. But there's a certain flexibility there that I really like. But I will for sure give the admission that if you lift up behind the curtain it's just a man there, just a man operating all the machines. You know, there's like not really this intense forethought that makes the setting hang really well together. And part of that comes from it having like 150 different authors and creators over its lifespan.
Yeah.
Like how could it be coherent thinking about that, you know?
I wouldn't expect it, right? Like I'm not casting aspersions on it for being what it is.
Yeah.
I think it makes perfect sense. And in some ways, much like the spirit of D, like we were saying, like AC checks and Vancian magic,
Yeah.
it fulfills the spirit of that by being accessible and convenient for whatever you want, just as you're saying. It's a matter of dials, right? Because you can dial up the accessibility of something, but then you dial down the sense of place that it has.
Yes.
The internal consistency, the richness of the world. If you make something for everyone will be able to have access to it, but then no one will really be able to really dig into it. And except, of course, if you're smart about it and you're running that kind of game, you make it about those characters in that moment, in that space. Then it works okay. But if you try to think of it as like a broad sweeping setting where everything seems to make sense and like, yeah, you could be up here in Waterdeep and then way over here, there's some other thing happening and somehow it's a very party focused setting. And if you think about it too hard, it stops making any damn sense.
You're right. It should be about a band of characters with their internal and external motivations. And it's about that and what they do. And everything else is backdrop to it. Because like something that they do as well that kind of bugs me, but it's not too bad. But it's something that a lot of big properties do nowadays is they make up for some of the blandness that they have achieved in their setting through a variety of factors with like an overuse of camp. And I'm not against camp. I like tongue in cheek and I'm there. I don't like things being too dour and self-serious all the time. You know, that's one of the big problems with 40K right now.
Yeah.
But like that is something where there's sort of like this playfulness that can be really fun. But when it goes through this like threshold to too much of it, it just completely steals any sense of drama or meaning. And that to me, D&D gets into a lot with like, you know, let's do a party of all gnomes and have the silliest adventures. And you know what I mean? I want people to have fun at their table doing what they want, right? Like we've always said. But there's a certain like, they make that as valid and as important a play style as anything else so that it almost weighs down the value of some of the other play styles where you're like trying to tell a story and you're trying to show a character overcome something. And it's just like, that doesn't matter because in that same setting, you could have like 4 gnome pickpockets who accidentally save the world. And maybe that's cool. And maybe I'm a little off base on that. I don't know. But like that is to me something that I feel like can be a detractor from any high magic setting, right? Where the crazy wackiness can become as important or as central. Like I like there to be a certain element of lightness and levity, but I don't want it to then all of a sudden be the central focus. Like I want that to still have drama, have weight, and have import, as opposed to just be like, and here's some comic relief, everybody.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's 2 points that I would make as advice for people running a game, role-playing game especially, well, specifically, which is whatever you're doing, you got to think of it like a bunch of dials that you're not going to have everything and have it work. You're going to have to pick what you want your themes to be. So if you want a lighthearted and comical game where everybody's playing a bunch of gnomes getting into mischief, that should be the focus of the game, right? And it will be comedic and it will be whimsical. It might even be goofy.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the line I think you're talking about crossing. It's just like, but we understand that's what it is. Like if I'm playing, it's funny. Some games do this explicitly. Paranoia does this. They have 3 modes of play.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember what they're called. I know one of them's called Zap. And I believe that's the goofy style. Like it's all comedy, all nonsense, all mishaps. And then they have I think they call it the WMD style of play, where it feels like you're playing a horror game.
Okay.
But it's like 1984 horror.
Oh.
Like it's the horror in being in a Kafka-esque world.
100%.
And then there's a style that's in the middle, which I guess they call classic.
Yeah.
I think that's what they call it.
See, that mentality would serve, I think, the approach to Faerun, where it's almost like by trying to simultaneously spin all the plates, it doesn't serve all the plates.
Well, and I think that's in that there's the solution. If you're running Faerun, don't spin all the plates like it seems like you're supposed to.
Yeah, it's true.
Pick the ones that you want in play. I think that's my point.
It's a buffet.
Yeah, exactly. It's absolutely a buffet style setting. And it's like you could have a horror game happen there. You could have a heroic fantasy game, an epic fantasy game. You could play ordinary people. You could play a comedic, goofy game.
Yeah, you can.
But I think one of my problems with that setting is that it doesn't say that you should pick one of those things. It says it could be like, by not saying anything, it kind of suggests that it could be anything as well. And it could be anything at any point in time. And I don't think that sets up, especially people who are new at running the game, to be like, oh, it should focus around this thing. Like that's the thing I would say about other role-playing games, is that like if I'm playing Vampire the Masquerade, it does an excellent job of bringing me into that world and making me feel the themes of that world and telling me what this is and what it is not. I don't have to play it that way. I could play it completely different. I could strip the rule system out and take a completely different thing. And now we're playing like immortal clowns with powers.
Yeah.
But at least it's setting a tone. I think that's the thing. So the other piece of advice that I would give, which is an extension of what I said, as far as like set your dials, know what you're running. But the other one is you want to set the expectation with the players. I guess it's the same piece of advice, but it's also, you want to tell people this is what your game is so that they know what they're in for, or they can buy in or not buy in, But the nice thing about having a setting that already has that preloaded into it is that people don't need you to do that as much. I mean, obviously if they've never heard of it, then you'll have to explain something, but it comes prepackaged with this, like, yeah, we're going to play Warhammer Fantasy, and it's grim dark.
Yeah.
And it's got this kind of folksy element, and it's got a little bit of humor to it and some other weird elements, but it has a specific flavor to it.
And it's very explicit about that flavor too, right? Like it doesn't mask its musk.
It's very forward about it. And again, this is what the other thing with why I think the idea that Forgotten Realms is like a concrete place.
Yeah.
It's weird. This is turning into more of just more talking about Forgotten Realms, but whatever. Is to go with a way more pulled back interpretation of that, like Dungeon Crawl Classics does, where it isn't actually any specific setting. It implies a setting, but it's not named. It doesn't have specific places, and it's more focused around those adventure modules.
Yeah, you're right.
And whatever you do in between that is just whatever you want to pull out of your head. So it doesn't have the advantage of being, as you say, being able to look it up on a Wikipedia and say, but it does fall into the thing where you're like, oh, well, what's the mayor of the town? The mayor of the town is Bob Bobbleson, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know. I really enjoy the performative improvisational aspects of running a game, and some settings really do that. And that's something I found Faerun great for, but it does mean there's a certain levity or take on drama and conflict that you have to roll with, where if you were playing Legend of the Five Rings, if you're playing that and you're like getting really deep on a very specific set of themes, on a very specific Shinto-influenced magic system, on duels, right? Like, if you're really going in on that, then you're really going to be in on the theme from the outset. So, yeah, that's a really good observation that, like, you as game master, control your dials. And it's something that I have to remind myself of because I keep wanting certain things out of a fantasy story, and I have to remind myself that, like, one, it's collaborative storytelling, so you can't just make it all up yourself, and two, you have to set the dials so that you get those outcomes. You know what I mean? Like, if you are just running a game master scenario and you kind of let the wackiness in, the players are going to do crazy things. They're already going to do crazy things.
You're going to give them license to do things that are not in theme with the game.
Yeah.
I mean, they might do that anyway. Like, I'm going to use a weird term, but they can Old Man Henderson your game.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, literally.
They can totally derail you. Yeah, going to Legend of the Five Rings.
Yeah.
That's an interesting example of a magic system done in a thematically different way that also affects the rules. So like we were saying, it's like Shinto magic.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like it's based on a kind of animism. So everything's being spirits and also like ancestor worship and these varying levels and significant spirits. But the way that plays out in the world is that everybody is kind of woven into magic. There are spellcasters, right? But they just practice a particular kind of spiritual magic that samurai also have access to. They just tap into it through combat or through swordsmanship.
Yes.
So I thought that was really interesting. So just to bring it back to the magic system part of it, we went off on a little tangent there.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, verisimilitude is important in a setting, especially one that uses magic.
Yes, right. And the magical impact, the impact of magic on a setting can help determine that verisimilitude, in summary of our earlier points. But something I want to jump to now is I want to straddle or drop across the stride to war games for a moment. Wargame magic traditionally has the problem of it being either too influenced by RPG magic, and you're like, what is the point of any of these spells? None of them mean anything to me on a battlefield because they're like, you can illuminate an 8-foot radius. And it's like, that's garbage to me. I am in a sword fight, right? So there's games that have done that. And then you can do the exact opposite where magic is exclusively combat-focused weaponry. And it's just like, oh, my wizard's basically a flamethrower backpack, you know? And that's what they are.
They're just like the ultimate weapon. Maybe at best they might be like a glass cannon where like if you can take them out, you're okay. But then they're basically an unstoppable murder machine.
Exactly. And I like when there is a bit of a mix, like, for example, like a spell that I think is really great in a war game that is less great in an RPG. A perfect example is teleport. Because in an RPG, that's like an obstacle killer. Like a GM can set up whatever they want, and as long as you have teleport, you're on the other side of it. But in a war game, it's about maneuver and position. So it gives you this really cool way to subvert maneuver by just picking up and dropping through magic. It's such a great way to use the physicality of a war game where you're like seeing the transportation of these guys, and it relationally means something. Now they're somewhere new. It's not quite like in a theater of the mind RPG where you're just like, there's a barrier, there's a wall in front of me, and now I'm beyond it. Take that wall, you know? Like in a war game, I had this memory of a chaos sorcerer taking an exalted hero and throwing him with a teleport right to the 9-inch mark, Age of Sigmar 2nd edition, behind a unit of dudes. And he rolled just high enough on his charge to then make the charge into me. He rolled like 5 or 6 attack dice, shredded the unit. It was just such a great moment. And it was all magically propelled by that teleportation, that slingshot. And it just kind of showed like battlefield magic doesn't have to be damage focused, but it has to be focused on one of the things you do on a battlefield, which maneuver being in most war games the most important thing that you do, or at least in my opinion, a good war game.
Yeah.
So that was Age of Sigmar, which also can sometimes do something neat with spells where you put down an endless spell or a manifestation where it's like a model that moves around, but it's a flaming skull. So that's like very interesting. I don't think it's done particularly dumbfoundingly well, we'll say, but it's at least very novel. And it's cool that you can get like a spell of a big scythe sweeping across the ground, and that's like a Shaishian blade of death or something, right? Something like that. So it's cool. But in terms of war game magic, that's kind of my perspective, is it's either you can go too far with it being utility based and it loses all meaning, or too far into it just being a weapon. So you kind of want to be in the sweet spot and use a lot of chance to influence it, so they feel kind of like you mentioned with RPG magic, that chaos magic. You definitely want that winds of chaos thing happening in a war game too, not just in Warhammer per se, but like a game that died too young, Rune Wars, was a Fantasy Flight Games miniatures game. Obviously, it died because FFG, but it had a really neat thing where you cast the runes at the start of the turn. So you had these double-sided cardboard chits that would show you either like a red fire rune or a green earth rune, and you would like shake your hand and throw them. And then you would use those combinations of runes to power spells at different levels of effectiveness. And it was really cool. And it kind of created this like winds of magic feeling, but in a kind of unique way. And I think that's really essential to a wargame magic system too, is that it's also not just a reliable weapon in your arsenal. It's something you have to kind of like broker with in a weird way. I'm kind of just giving you my thoughts. Give me some of your perspective on this too, because I would like to get your angle on it, who spent more time with the role-playing perspective on it.
I would say that, like, while role-playing games are more inherently, like, specifically narrative, even when they try not to be, they just, you know, you're dealing with individuals, so you're going to get individual stories. And that's actually true of war games as well. There's absolutely a narrative element. But I think a thing that I've noticed from like looking at the history of wargaming is there's this inherent speculative element of wargaming. And some of the times that speculation is like, what if the end of World War II, if the Americans fought the Russians instead of calling it a day.
Yeah, like Operation Unthinkable or something, right?
Yeah, if it turns into an Operation Unthinkable, that's one form of war game speculation. And again, there are people in like a historical war game hobby. I'm well acquainted with many of the old heads that shake their finger at that.
Like, you're not allowed to do that.
Yeah. Or they kind of frown like as if that's frivolous or silly. But the mere act of creating fantasy and sci-fi wargaming is going into that speculative nature. And so a lot of what fantasy wargaming in terms of magic is, well, what if I could do this?
Yeah.
Right? Like, imagine we have armies, they operate as normal, and then I then teleport behind them and shoot lightning. Right? And it's adding like an X factor, and it really does play into that wargaming what if.
That's true. That's a good read.
Speculative mindset. Like some wargamers are just about like, oh yeah, I want to do that history. Some people are more competitive. Some people are more narrative. And some people just want to know, like, once they become familiar with a game or a system, they're like, well, what if I put this in it?
Yeah.
And sometimes that could just be a weird army list build that like never existed. Like, another example of in a World War II context was like fielding Pershing tanks, right? Because they didn't really, like, they were in the war, but like only briefly. And it's like, well, what is it? What's it like to fight one of those? And then there comes in inevitably the problem of how do you stat that properly?
Yes.
Magic's basically just an extension of that, but with a lot more free reign. I mean, a lot more, because even in a sci-fi game, you're basically playing around with some of the formations of things. Like, I'm thinking like, sometimes the way that I describe the complexity of BattleTech to people is that one mech is actually more like a platoon of guys all strapped together.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Well, and like, that's an order of battle game like nothing else, right?
Yeah, right. It's operating on a very crunchy level. But if you look at it, it does function a lot of the ways the other games. But like, what I mean is that like the organizational structure, instead of being like, you know, a squad or a platoon or a battalion, is a giant robot.
Yeah.
And then those other things are then layered back in. But it's still, I want to say it's more or less conventional warfare. It's warfare plus, whereas fantasy is warfare ?
Yes. And sci-fantasy too, like 30K and 40K, very much in that same idea.
Yeah, as soon as you put a magic-like system, like it could be psychers or other like phenomena, as soon as it smells like magic in your war game, you're really giving you're basically giving license to not do whatever, Like, it should be fair, and it should be like, well, but the what if factor goes way up.
And that makes it really interesting. Yeah, like I said, I don't love using magic in role-playing games because I've had a really hard time finding the magic system that speaks to me out of my fantasy. But like the Chaos God Tzeentch is my favorite Chaos God from the wargaming.
The most magic-y of all Chaos Gods.
But that's like from the wargame angle where I love using magic because it's like, not to be annoying, but it's like you're the exceptions guy. You know what I mean? You're like, oh, you know how this rule works? Well, for me, it don't. It does this. Oh, you know how you thought you could do this? Well, I do this. And you thought that you had this? Well, I do this. You know, like
it's playing a blue deck in Magic. You're just like, oh, you thought you did that, but you didn't.
Yeah.
Try again.
No, you're
Try
not
again.
Wrong. You're not wrong. So it's like, it's interesting that I can really enjoy Magic in wargaming and not have that same feeling when I'm role playing. But there are war games that do Magic better than others. Like classic fantasy, Warhammer has done as many Magic systems as there are editions, basically. Like they've renovated that a few times. 40K completely has renovated their system more than once to really like change how they do things. A personal favorite of mine for like a good RPG inspired fantasy system, like Magic system story in a fantasy game, would be Frostgrave. As that is a D20 skirmish game. It's very much like you are one person piloting a D&D party in a certain capacity. And the magic in that game is a really good example of utility magic that is valuable. It's not just like illumination spells and mage hand in the middle of a sword fight. You know, it's like things you may actually want to use to get your objectives done. So I would argue Frostgrave is one of the best examples of magic in a skirmish game. And then you can pair that with Stargrave, its sci-fi cousin, and that basically makes magic a mix of the Force, sure. There's definitely like that vibe, but also sort of like Han Solo's charm sort of becomes a power now, right? So like that larger than life pulp aspect is sort of made the magic of that, or the equivalent of magic, so to speak. And that's really interesting and really cool. But it also is kind of a byproduct of it being the sci-fi version of a fantasy game, which already had like a very set up specific magic system.
Obviously, we're coming close to the end now, but like, I'm curious in your ideas around psionics and superpowers. I know those are fairly different things, but like, just as like, are they just another kind of magic, or is there something like even some aspects of like mutation kind of lend themselves to being like magical in their expression?
Yes. Like they are a form of character feat, right? Of like, I don't necessarily mean feat like 3.5, but like they're like an exceptional verb, you know? And whether you define that as having an arcane, technological, psionic, or radioactive origin point, it's still kind of like the jazz you can do, you know?
Yep.
So I see a design similarity in that you need to approach the question of your development of these abilities the same way. It's just you should be using different systems and resources and implementations to make them distinct from each other, right? Like if you're going to do magic one way, probably don't do psionics in a parallel or compatible way, because then there won't be a distinction, right? Try and come up with something that's like perpendicular to that shit. You know, come up with a different angle. Take that as a challenge in the design process and come up with something that's unique. But fundamentally, it is just fundamentally a magic power is a superpower, is a psionic power, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay. I might push back on that a little bit. I don't think you're wrong. I think that is one way to interpret that. But I do think that there's this idea that, do these things have a characteristic that makes them feel unique or different? Like, Does it say something about, so if you only had one of those, does it say something about your game aside from it being sci-fi or fantasy? We'll take psionics and magic as an example. So in Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40,000, they are essentially synonymous with each other. They have certain unique quirks about them, but it's more in the details than anything else. It has more to do with the specific elements and history of the setting, and not so much fundamentally. Fundamentally, they are really just the same thing. I mean, you could tell me otherwise. Certainly, you're more familiar with those.
But they are in that setting, not necessarily in all times, right? Which is kind of my general feeling of it is more often than not they're very similar. But I'm interested in your take on this.
So there's some systems of psychic powers that say I could take from GURPS, and I could make a game that has a lot more subtlety to it, because one aspect you can dig into psionic powers is more in the are you familiar with the paranormal horror genre of movies? Okay,
what's an example?
Scanners.
Yes, that is a cool movie. It's also super messed up, but yes, I know Scanners.
Yeah, or so it's basically like psychic horror.
Yeah.
Firestarter, various other ones. So the characters in those movies have paranormal abilities that feel very bespoke, or at the very least, much more subtle.
Okay.
Right? Like the ability to bend a spoon. We're not talking about like, you can cast fireball. Well, I guess a pyrokinetic could probably do that, but there's usually more rules laden onto it.
Okay.
So, not that this is anything to do with paranormal horror or psychic horror as a subgenre, but like, I always thought it was interesting in the X-Men that Iceman could basically slow the atoms of something and then make it freeze.
Right.
But Pyro can't start a fire. He can only manipulate an existing one.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't know if you know that, but like...
Yeah, I never thought of that.
He has to carry fuel around with him, or at least like a lighter.
I remember that. Yeah, that's true.
He can expand out the flame. And so like you could layer on that kind of theming to create a much more, I don't know, something about psionic. If you take it from the way that it's expressly shown in certain movies, it's a lot more downplayed. Like you could actually take kinetic abilities right off the table. What if it was just reading minds and like swapping into other people's bodies? There was an animated show, sort of rotoscope animated show called Delta State. I don't know if you remember that. And it had 4 characters that had psychic abilities. Not one of them was physical. It was like precognition, recognition, telepathy, and one other one. I don't remember what it was.
Right.
But none of them had kinetic powers. They used them to basically like solve mysteries. And there was like a secret organization that was trying to track them down and also do other stuff. Weird show, kind of neat, not great, but it made it a perfect example of a show that, or like a fiction where psionics don't feel like magic in the same way.
Yeah.
Like they're fantastical, but they're very retained. And then I think you could apply that to superpowers as well, because superpowers, I think, lean more into the bespokeness. So Spider-Man can climb on walls, and he's got super senses. And depending on what version of the character, the webbing is either part of the power or it's something that he just knows how to build. It's some kind of super science, I guess.
But if I'm understanding, there's like an inherent principle to some of these powers that the arcane magic doesn't have, because arcane magic can be learned and transferred and whatever, right? Is that part of it?
So, I mean, arcane magic can have rules too, but I think there's a certain, like, what the rules between each of these systems suggest a difference. It doesn't have to have a difference, but it kind of can suggest that. And either independently of any other system, so that being the theming of the game. So if you're playing Scanners, the role-playing game, not only are your powers more limited, but you don't have anything else to compare it to. So it's much more like the powers make the vibe of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
You could also do it comparatively. So maybe magic works one way and psionics work a different way, and they aren't compatible per se, but they do kind of fill different niches. So a good example of this is in Dark Sun. Magic is not reliable / dangerous to the world and the people in it, but is also way more flexible the way that you'd think of magic. But psionic powers are more reliable, less dangerous, and more common. And that they're not really the same thing.
And now I tend to think that is like up to the designer to do. I don't know that, like, I know what you mean. Like thematically, there are inherent assumptions we make about these headers, you know? I think there's nothing inherent about them as principles when it comes to their application in a game outside of like, hopefully the expectation of the gamer or audience is met with their assumptions by the mechanics, you know, in this, you know what I'm trying to say?
I suppose you're right.
Because like there's sort of the I bring to the game what I think a psionic is, right? Like wow, brain power. And then the game informs me like, yes, but only that. No mind spike. You know what I mean? You're like, oh, okay, cool. Gotcha. But it's like, it's that shared thing. And I think that's on the game or the role-playing game or whatever specific, like,
or the setting or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. To like, make that communication, because you're right, they thematically are different from each other, especially when you make the argument that superpowers are very bespoke. Like that's actually something that's interesting, because you can't learn to be Spider-Man. It doesn't matter how good a wizard you are, you can't learn to be him, really. I mean, maybe
the thing that I was going off of that is Spider-Man can't be Wolverine.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe there's a plot line where that could happen. They do have what if stories.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Those are my favorite Marvel comics, by the way, were just the What If series. Just because it was just like, yeah, I get the premise of these characters. I want to see the goofy nonsense. Anyway, so like superpowers are very much like you get this set of powers. This is one of the reasons why I think that Cypher is such a good supers system. It's because you get this set of powers, and those powers get better, but you don't really get anybody else's power. So everybody remains unique. I feel like I'm Spider-Man and you feel like you're Wolverine, and that person feels like they're Storm.
Yeah.
And we can play to that niche and it doesn't get messy. But I don't find that like the distinctions in, say, the winds of magic, they're distinctions because they're different winds, right? They all represent something else. And I guess in Warhammer, the suggestion is that like humans only have the lifespan and capacity for one of these.
That's right.
Unless they're playing with fire, in which case it's going to end badly. Elves have more of a lifespan and more capacity to learn multiple winds or be able to manipulate multiple aspects of magic. But like, so there are rules, but they're different rules, right? Like technically you could try your hand at whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's more for safety reasons that you don't, not because that doesn't thematically make sense.
Yes, right, totally. And that's the difference between a wizard and a sorcerer.
Well, yeah, so even within Dungeons and Dragons, at least like from 3rd edition going forward, there's even distinctions with like how mages tap into magic, right?
Yep. Wizard, sorcerer, warlock being the big triplicate.
Yeah, and you could go as far as to include clerics in there as well.
That's divine. That's different.
No, it's not.
But that's the thing is like...
I mean, it is. To be fair, it is different, but it's by its effect, it's not.
That's kind of the thing that some magic systems do better than others, is when they make these effects feel distinct, when ultimately there's not a lot that separates them other than the thematic implication of choosing one over the other, right?
Yeah. Like, again, like you can even, like D&D is good at, and other Dungeons and Dragons based things are good at tailoring certain things. So you can exclude a class. Well, here's a fun experiment for you all out there. Ken St. Andre, when he created Dungeons and Trolls, didn't like clerics because he didn't like, I guess, what he viewed as a Judeo-Christian magic setting or system, like, or something. He just didn't vibe on that. So he left them out. So Tunnels and Trolls has this different feel about it.
Yes.
Because it's literally just like warriors, thieves, and wizards. But here's a fun experiment. Do the same thing with any one of those, like exclude all but one kind of caster and see how that makes your setting feel.
Yeah.
Like What if it's only clerics? What does that feel like? That makes all magical hegemony religious in nature, or at least given into by the gods.
It means you play the little people in an exalted campaign.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Or, if everyone's warlocks, well, then the only way to access magic is to make these dark pacts with things. Or, fun combination still, clerics and warlocks only. Like, 2 of them. There's 2 ways to do it. It's basically the upfront devotion or the backdoor deal.
Yeah, totally. That's really cool.
Right. And so that's what I think you can really understand the flavor of what you're putting forward as a game if you focus down on something.
Yeah,
right?
That's true.
Or sometimes you can mold those things into, like in Dungeon Crawl Classics, wizards are wizards, but they're also a bit like warlocks, or they have that potential.
Yeah, they do. They for sure have that patronage thing going on.
You can go out and get a patron and make your magic way crazier and make yourself way weirder. I mean, we could talk about this all day, but I think we hit some pretty key points there.
Yeah.
Sorry to everyone that it turned into a weird rant about Forgotten Realms there for a bit, but I mean, it's all part of the process.
We go back to that. I'm actively running a Faerun campaign, so it's in my mind. But either way, thanks for listening and jamming on this with us about magic, powers, superpowers, psionics. But next week, we're going to go into a war game. We're going to do the indie epic-inspired Laserstorm 2nd Edition. This is by Nordic Weasel Games. It is an excellent 6 to 15 mil sci-fi scale game for getting those big battles down, and we look really forward to giving you the details.
Yeah, I'm excited. All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the show, and happy gaming. Have a good one.
Happy gaming.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.